Miss Hannah Wynne never expected her quiet life at Redfern Ridge to change. At 33, she had long made peace with her solitary existence as the town's schoolteacher. Marriage and motherhood, once her deepest dreams, had faded into the same distance as her girlhood. Yet on one windswept afternoon, a man stepped into her doorway who would undo every certainty she had built around herself. He filled the entrance like a living shadow, 6 feet 6 of weathered strength, his hat held respectfully in one hand. "I need a wife," he said, voice low and unhurried, a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "And you need strong sons to guard your winters. No courtship, no flattery, just plain truth from a man who looked as if he had never spoken anything but. That man was David Cutter, and his words would shake the foundations of her carefully ordered world." I'd love to hear where you're joining from. Leave a comment. And now, back to our story. The September wind carried the scent of dying grass across the plains, sweeping through the cracks of the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Wynne had taught for 8 long years. The building groaned beneath the force of the gusts, its weathered boards bearing the scars of many Wyoming winters. Hannah stood at the chalkboard, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows of her gray wool dress, her brown hair drawn back into its usual practical bun. Her voice, calm and sure, filled the room. 7 times 8, Josiah?" The boy's brow furrowed, tongue caught between his teeth as he worked out the answer. 56, Miss Wynne." "Very good," she said, her smile softening the discipline in her posture. Her features, though not striking in the way of city ladies, held a quiet warmth that made people feel seen. Her mother had always said her eyes were her best feature, hazel that shifted with her moods, though of late they held more wistfulness than light. The slanting afternoon sun painted golden lines across the desks, where her pupils bent over their slates. Every inch of the schoolroom bore her touch, the alphabet cards painted by hand, the small shelf of books she'd purchased from her meager wages, the potbelly stove she tended like a mother with her child. This place was more than work. It was her refuge, her purpose, her entire world. Here, she mattered. Here she was Miss Wynne, the teacher who had coaxed the Carmichael boy into reading, who had shown Mary Patterson that girls could wield numbers as deftly as boys, who somehow kept order in a frontier town where education was often an afterthought. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the vast ocean of prairie beyond. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, clothed in buffalo grass and punctuated by the occasional cottonwood marking hidden creeks. The land was both beautiful and cruel, demanding everything, offering little in return. 8 years ago, she hadn't chosen it for beauty. She had come to Wyoming to escape. Back in Ohio, she had once been engaged to Henry Morrison, a banker's son with polished manners and a future neatly arranged by his father's ledger. When the match proved inconvenient, when it became clear that Hannah brought no dowry, no connection, no advantage, he had ended it with a quiet conversation and downcast eyes. No harsh words, no great scandal, just disappointment sealed in politeness. Within 2 weeks, she had packed her modest belongings and boarded the train west, answering a notice for a schoolteacher needed in Redfern Ridge. Her parents had begged her to stay, but pride and pain had carried her farther than reason might have. The early years had been hard. The loneliness of winter, the ceaseless wind, the silence that pressed in after nightfall. But over time, she had built something resembling a life. The townsfolk respected her. Their children adored her. And though she often told herself she had made peace with spinsterhood, peace was not quite the same as joy. Lately, that ache had begun to whisper again, at weddings, at christenings, at every gathering where she stood apart, smiling like an aunt instead of a bride. The sound of heavy boots on the steps outside broke her reverie. She glanced toward the door. A parent, perhaps, come early for a child. The clock neared 3:30. Lessons would end soon enough. "Miss Wynne," said Sarah Mitchell, one of her brightest girls, raising a hand. "I've finished my arithmetic. May I help Josiah with his?" "Of course, dear," Hannah said, warmth returning to her voice. "That's very kind of you." She watched as Sarah moved to the younger boy's side, explaining patiently, her voice low and sure. Hannah smiled. Sarah would make a fine teacher someday if her parents allowed her the schooling. The boots sounded again, closer this time, followed by the faint jingle of spurs. Not a shopkeeper, then. A rancher. Hannah smoothed her skirt and straightened her posture, preparing for whatever business had brought him. The door opened with a long, familiar creak. A gust of prairie air swept in, and with it a man so tall and broad he seemed to block the very light. David Cutter. She had seen him before from a distance, at Sunday services at the general store, but never close enough to realize how truly imposing he was. His shoulders filled the doorway, his black Stetson cradled respectfully in his calloused hands. Sun and labor had carved lines into his face, silver threading through his dark hair, but his eyes, deep brown, steady, held something unexpectedly gentle. "Miss Wynne," he said, his voice slow like a river moving under ice. "Might I have a word with you?" The room fell silent. Even the youngest children seemed to hold their breath. To them, David Cutter was legend, the man who tamed wild horses and once fought off wolves with only a knife. "Of course, Mr. Cutter," Hannah managed, though her pulse had quickened. "Children, continue your work quietly. I'll be just outside." She rose, smoothing her skirt once more, aware of how small she must appear beside him, and as she stepped toward the door, she had no way of knowing that this conversation, the one about to begin, would change everything she thought she knew about her future. At 5'4", Hannah Wynne had always considered herself of ordinary stature. But standing before David Cutter on the porch of the schoolhouse, she felt almost fragile in his shadow. He was a mountain of a man, broad and steady, the kind who seemed carved from the very land he worked. She closed the door behind her, granting them privacy, though the murmur of her students still drifted faintly through the windows. The sun was warm on her face, but a shiver coursed through her that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. This was entirely unprecedented. David Cutter, the most self-contained man in Redfern Ridge, seeking her out for a private conversation. In all her years here, their exchanges had never gone beyond polite greetings after Sunday service. He stood with his back to the open prairie, the light outlining his broad shoulders. There was something in his bearing, steady, deliberate, that told her this was no casual visit. "Miss Wynne," he began, then paused as if measuring his words before releasing them. "You'll likely think it's strange, me coming here like this," he said at last, "but I've got something important to discuss with you." Hannah clasped her hands in front of her, the gesture automatic, one she often used to hide her unease. "I'm listening, Mr. Cutter." He looked at her then, really looked, and the intensity in those deep brown eyes made her heartbeat falter. From inside came the faint sound of chalk tapping and children reciting, the familiar music of her ordered world. "I need a wife," he said simply, as if remarking on the weather, "and you need strong sons to guard your winters." For a moment, she thought she must have misheard him. The words hit with the quiet force of a hammer, unexpected, absurd, impossible. But his face remained calm, his tone grave. He meant every syllable. In her mind's eye, she saw her mother's wedding ring, tucked away in a small jewelry box at home. A simple gold band that once symbolized all she had buried: love, companionship, a shared life. She hadn't looked at it in years, yet suddenly it felt close again, gleaming in memory. "I," she began, then faltered. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Mr. Cutter." "I'm not asking," he said gently but firmly. "I'm stating two facts. My ranch needs a woman's hand before winter sets in. And you," he hesitated, his gaze unwavering, "you've got no one to look after you when the snows come. This town can be unkind to women alone, and you know it as well as I do." His words, so blunt and unembellished, should have offended her. Marriage reduced to practicality, security in exchange for company. Yet beneath the starkness of it lay something else: respect, a recognition of her worth, even if framed in the language of necessity. "Mr. Cutter," she said softly, "I hardly know you." "You know what matters," he replied. "You know I work hard and keep my word. I've never been married, never had children. I pay my debts and speak plain. You know that much. And you know," his voice dropped lower, "you're tired of being alone." The truth of it struck like a spark to dry grass. She turned away, looking out over the endless sweep of prairie to hide the flush rising in her cheeks. The wind stirred her hair loose from its pins, tugging strands across her face. The silence that followed stretched between them, filled with the rustle of grass and the faint lowing of cattle from the far hills. Inside, Sarah Mitchell's young voice carried through the window, explaining fractions to the younger children. Steady, familiar, safe. That was her life. Dependable, useful, solitary. And this man, This towering stranger was offering to upend it all with a single, impossible proposition. "I don't understand why you've come to me," she said at last. "Surely there are younger women who would." "I don't want a girl," he interrupted, not unkindly. "I want a woman who knows her own mind. Someone who's faced hardship and didn't run from it. Someone who can stand her ground." He nodded toward the schoolhouse. "You've done that for 8 years. That tells me what kind of woman you are." Something fluttered in her chest, not quite hope, but something dangerously near it. When was the last time anyone had spoken to her that way? As though she were seen, valued, not for what she could do, but for who she was. "And what exactly," she asked carefully, "are you proposing, Mr. Cutter?" "Marriage," he said simply. "A partnership. I won't pretend it's about love. I don't know much about that, but I do know about respect, and I know how to care for what's mine. You'd have a home, security, a place by my side. And maybe," he hesitated, his voice quieting, "in time we'd find something more than convenience in each other's company." It was the most honest proposal she could imagine. No poetry, no pretense, just a man offering what he could, asking nothing he would not give in return. "I would need time to consider," she said finally, though her pulse still raced. "Of course." He placed his hat back on his head, the brim casting shadow over his eyes. "But don't take too long, Miss Wynne. Winter's coming whether we're ready or not, and some choices get harder the longer you wait to make them." He tipped his hat in farewell, then descended the steps with the unhurried grace of a man who feared nothing. His bay gelding waited just beyond the fence, massive, sure-footed, the only creature in the territory large enough to carry him with ease. In a moment, he had swung into the saddle and turned toward the open prairie. Hannah watched him ride away until his silhouette melted into the horizon. For a long while she stood there, her hand resting on the porch railing, heart beating with a confusion of thoughts she couldn't yet name. Inside, the hum of lessons continued. Sarah's patient voice, Josiah's arithmetic, the scratch of chalk on slate. Life as it had always been, and yet nothing felt the same. When she finally re-entered the classroom, Sarah looked up with curious eyes. "Was that about one of us, Miss Wynne? Are we in trouble?" "No, dear," Hannah said quietly, forcing a small smile. "Nothing like that at all." But as she guided her students through their final sums, her mind kept drifting to the simple gold ring waiting in her jewelry box, and to the man whose plain-spoken words had somehow rekindled its meaning. That evening, at her small kitchen table, she stared at the document David Cutter had left behind. The paper was neatly folded, his handwriting careful and surprisingly elegant. It was not a love letter, but a contract, a proposal of practicality, written with the same honesty he had spoken. It lay before her like a bridge between two worlds, one familiar, safe and small, the other unknown, vast and full of dangerous possibility. And as the wind howled against her cottage walls, Hannah Wynne began to wonder which kind of life she truly wanted to call her own. The contract was handwritten in a careful masculine script that surprised her. She had expected something crude befitting a rough rancher, but the penmanship was educated, thoughtful. The terms were fair more than fair. She would keep her teaching position if she desired, have her own household allowance, maintain separate quarters at first, and be treated with the respect due a wife in all public matters. "Marriage of practical convenience," she read aloud, the words echoing in her empty cottage. David Cutter and Hannah Wynne entered into for mutual benefit and protection, with the understanding that affection may grow but is not required for the fulfillment of marital duties. The clinical language should have repelled her, but instead she found it oddly comforting. No false promises, no deceptions about love at first sight, just two adults making a sensible decision about their futures. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She folded the contract quickly, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to hide it. Through the window she saw Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, her round face creased with concern. "Hannah, dear," the older woman said as the door opened, "I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I heard the most extraordinary thing at the store today." "Please, come in," Hannah replied. She stepped aside, knowing that whatever Mrs. Henderson had heard would be all over town by morning. "Would you like some tea?" "That would be lovely." Mrs. Henderson settled herself in the tiny parlor, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Hannah's modest home. "Now then," she began, "is it true that David Cutter came to see you at the school today?" Word traveled fast in a town of 300 souls. Hannah busied herself with the tea kettle, buying time to think. "Mr. Cutter did stop by, yes." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the eager anticipation of one who thrived on being the first to know the latest news. "And what did he want?" Hannah poured the tea carefully, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "He had a proposition for me." "What sort of proposition?" The older woman leaned forward, eyes bright with curiosity. There was no point in trying to keep it secret. By tomorrow, everyone would know anyway. Small towns had their own mysterious ways of spreading information. Better to control the story herself. "He asked me to marry him," Hannah said simply. Mrs. Henderson's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Marry him? David Cutter? But he's never shown interest in any woman, not in all the years he's been here, and you two barely know each other." "That's what I told him," Hannah replied, settling into her chair with her own cup. "He said it was a practical arrangement. He needs a wife, and I need—" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Security." The older woman stared at her in amazement. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I would consider it." Mrs. Henderson set down her tea entirely, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Hannah, dear, I know the winters are hard on you, living alone out here, but marriage to a man you don't love, are you sure this is wise?" The question hung in the air between them. Was it wise? By conventional standards, certainly not. But conventional standards had not served her particularly well so far. "What would you have me do, Mrs. Henderson?" Hannah asked quietly. "I'm 33 years old, I have no family, no prospects, and every year that passes makes it less likely I'll find a traditional marriage. Mr. Cutter is offering me a chance at a different kind of life." "But he's so—" Mrs. Henderson gestured vaguely, searching for words. "Imposing, intimidating. All those stories about his strength, his temper when crossed. Aren't you afraid?" Hannah considered the question seriously. She had heard the stories of his physical prowess, his success with the ranch, the way other men deferred to him. But in their brief conversation, she had seen something else beneath the intimidating exterior. "He was gentle with me," she said finally, "respectful, honest about what he could offer and what he expected in return. There are worse things than marrying a good man who deals fairly." Mrs. Henderson shook her head, clearly unconvinced. "The whole town will be talking about this. Some will say you're being practical, but others will say I'm desperate," Hannah finished for her. "Perhaps they're right, but perhaps being desperate isn't always a bad thing if it leads you to make a necessary change." After Mrs. Henderson left, Hannah returned to the contract. She read it through 3 more times, considering each clause and implication. The marriage would take place within 2 weeks if she agreed. She would move to his ranch, but could maintain the schoolhouse as long as she wished. He would provide for her material needs and protect her as his wife. In return, she would manage his household and, in time, hopefully bear his children. The next morning brought a parade of visitors, each more curious than the last. By noon, it seemed half the town had found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or her cottage. The reactions were predictably mixed, some shocked, some envious, some disapproving. "I think it's romantic," declared Mary Patterson, one of her former students, now a young wife with 3 children. "Like something from a storybook, the mysterious rancher and the school teacher." "I think it's scandalous," countered Mrs. Hartwell, the preacher's wife. "Marriage should be based on love and Christian devotion, not mere convenience." Dr. Bennett, distantly related to her former fiancé, took a more practical view. "David Cutter's a good man, if a solitary one. Honest, hardworking, prosperous. You could do worse, Miss Wynne." But it was 8-year-old Josiah Fletcher who offered the most compelling argument. When she walked him home after school, he looked up at her with serious blue eyes and asked, "Miss Wynne, are you really going to marry Mr. Cutter?" "I'm thinking about it, Josiah." "Why?" "Because he fixed our fence when Papa hurt his back and didn't ask for anything in return. And he let me pet his horse once. His hands are real big, but he was gentle with the horse. Mama says gentle hands mean a gentle heart." That evening, Hannah stood at her window, watching the prairie glow under the setting sun. The vastness of the land never failed to move her. its beauty and its harshness intertwined like lovers locked in an eternal dance. She thought about the life she had built here, the careful routines that had sustained her through 8 years of solitude. It was a good life, respectable and useful, but it was also limited. She was 33, and the dream she had carried from Ohio, a husband, children, a home filled with laughter and love, had slowly withered like flowers in drought. But what if they didn't have to wither? What if instead of the romantic love she had once imagined, there could be something else: partnership, respect, shared purpose? David Cutter was offering her the chance to find out. She retrieved the contract from her kitchen drawer and read it one final time. Then, with steady hands, she signed her name at the bottom: Hannah Wynne, soon to become Hannah Cutter. The act felt both momentous and surprisingly simple, like stepping across a threshold into a room she had never seen but somehow always known was waiting for her. Tomorrow, she would find David and give him her answer. Tonight, she would pack away her mother's wedding ring and prepare to discover what kind of life could be built on honesty instead of romance, on practical partnership instead of passionate love. The contract lay on her table, signed and sealed, a bridge between her careful past and her uncertain future. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of change. The next morning, when Hannah delivered her signed contract to David Cutter's ranch, she carried her teaching slate and the worn piece of smooth stone that had been her constant companion for 8 years. It seemed fitting somehow, this symbol of her independence accompanying her as she took the first step toward a very different kind of life. The Cutter Ranch house sat in a natural depression between two low hills, sheltered from the worst of the prairie winds but positioned to catch the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, a solid log structure with a wide front porch and several outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. As she approached, she saw David working near the corral, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance. He looked up as she drew near, setting aside the bridle he had been mending and walking toward her with that easy, ground-covering stride she had noticed before. He was bareheaded in the morning light, his dark hair catching glints of silver, and there was something in his expression, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, that made her realize this arrangement mattered to him more than his practical words had suggested. "Miss Wynne," he said, touching his hat brim in greeting. "I wasn't expecting you so early." "I wanted to speak with you before the school day began," she replied, drawing the folded contract from her reticule. "I've made my decision." His eyes dropped to the paper in her hands, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly. Whether from anticipation or anxiety, she couldn't tell. When he looked back at her face, his expression was carefully neutral. Without a word, she handed him the signed contract. She watched as his eyes scanned the document, pausing at her signature at the bottom. When he looked up again, something had changed in his expression, softened, as if a tension he had been carrying for days had finally released. "You're certain about this?" he asked quietly. "As certain as anyone can be about the unknown," she replied. "I have conditions, Mr. Cutter." "David," he corrected gently, "and I expected you would. What are they?" She had rehearsed this conversation during the long walk to his ranch, but now, standing before the imposing man who would soon be her husband, the words felt awkward on her tongue. "I want to continue teaching, at least for now. The children depend on me, and I need to know that I can still be useful in that way." "Agreed. What else?" "Separate bedrooms, initially. I know that may seem—" "Sensible," he interrupted. "We're strangers entering a practical arrangement. There's no rush to complicate things beyond what they already are." His easy acceptance of her terms surprised her. She had expected some resistance, some assertion of husbandly rights. Instead, he treated her conditions with the same practical consideration he had shown throughout their brief acquaintance. "Is there anything else?" he asked. She looked down at the teaching slate in her hands, its smooth surface worn from years of lessons and demonstrations. "I want your word that you'll respect the person I am now, not try to change me into someone you think a wife should be." David was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Hannah," he said, and the sound of her given name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. I asked you to marry me because of who you are, not despite it. I don't want a different woman. I want you. The simple honesty of the statement struck her like a physical blow. When had anyone last wanted her specifically? For herself, rather than for what she could provide or represent? The feeling was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. 2 weeks, he continued, his voice returning to its practical tone. Will that give you enough time to make arrangements with the school board about continuing your teaching? Yes, she managed, though her voice came out slightly unsteady. Yes, I think so. Good. I'll speak with Reverend Matthews about the ceremony. Nothing fancy, just the legal requirements and a few witnesses. She nodded, then hesitated. There was so much they hadn't discussed, so many practical details that would need to be worked out. David, she said, testing his name on her tongue and finding it fit better than she had expected. What do you expect from me day to day? I mean, I've lived alone for 8 years. I don't know how to be a wife. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. I don't know how to be a husband either. I figure we'll learn together. The simplicity of it was both reassuring and daunting. No grand romantic gestures, no passionate declarations, just two people agreeing to figure out life together as they went along. She spent the next 2 weeks in a strange suspension between her old life and her new one. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of fascination and concern, as if she were a curious specimen of womanhood gone slightly mad. Some of the women offered marriage advice, tips on cooking and household management that assumed she knew nothing about running a home. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, took it upon herself to educate Hannah about wifely duties, speaking in euphemisms that would have been amusing if they hadn't been so mortifying. Others shared their own marriage stories, some happy, some cautionary, all delivered with the air of women welcoming a new member to their mysterious sisterhood. The men were simpler in their reactions. They either congratulated her on making a good match or looked at her with that peculiar mixture of pity and bewilderment men reserved for women who made choices they couldn't quite understand. Through it all, Hannah continued teaching, holding her classes and tending to her students with the same quiet dedication she always had. The teaching slate became her anchor, its familiar weight in her hands reminding her that, regardless of what else might change, she was still Miss Wynne, educator and guardian of young minds. It was young Sarah Mitchell who asked the question that had been haunting Hannah herself. Miss Wynne, after you get married, will you still be our teacher? For as long as you need me and I'm able, Hannah replied, though even as she said the words, she wondered if she was making a promise she might not be able to keep. Will you have babies? Asked little Emma Cole with the frank curiosity of childhood. The question sent heat flooding to Hannah's cheeks. Children had been part of David's original proposition, the promise of strong sons to guard her winters. The thought of bearing his children, of creating life with this man she barely knew, was both thrilling and terrifying. Perhaps, she said carefully, someday. As the wedding day approached, Hannah found herself caught between anticipation and panic. She had no wedding dress. Such luxuries seemed inappropriate for a marriage of convenience, but she did have a good blue wool dress that brought out her eyes. It would have to do. The night before the ceremony, she sat in her cottage for what might be the last time as a single woman, her teaching slate propped against the lamp on her table. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. David Cutter, mistress of one of the largest ranches in 3 counties. The transformation seemed impossible to believe. She thought about the dreams she had carried as a young woman, romantic notions of courtship and passionate love, of being swept off her feet by a man who would adore her above all else. Those dreams belonged to someone else now, someone younger and more innocent, someone who hadn't yet learned that life rarely matched the stories in books. But perhaps there were different kinds of dreams, more practical ones that could still lead to happiness. Perhaps partnership and respect could grow into something deeper, more lasting than the fleeting passion she had once imagined. The teaching slate caught the lamplight, its surface reflecting her face back at her in wavering, uncertain lines. Tomorrow she would discover what kind of woman she would become as David Cutter's wife. Tonight, She was still Hannah Wynne, schoolteacher, independent and alone, but no longer entirely resigned to remaining so. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast, challenging, and full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in Reverend Matthew's small church, with only a handful of witnesses present. Hannah wore her blue wool dress and carried a simple bouquet of prairie wildflowers that David had surprised her with, purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans he had gathered himself from the hills surrounding his ranch. As they stood before the altar, she was acutely aware of the vast size difference between them. Her hand felt tiny in his as they exchanged vows that were practical rather than poetic, promising to care for each other in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, but making no mention of love or cherishing. It was exactly what they had agreed upon. Yet something in Hannah's chest ached for the words that weren't spoken. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, David lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it brought tears to her eyes. Then it was over, and she was Mrs. Cutter, bound to a man she had known for less than a month. The ride to the ranch house in David's wagon was quiet, filled with the awkward silence of two people who had just committed their lives to each other without really knowing what commitment would mean in practice. Hannah kept her hands folded in her lap, clutching the wildflower bouquet and trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach. "Nervous?" David asked as they approached the house. "Yes," she admitted. "You?" "Yes," he replied, and somehow his honesty made her feel better. The ranch house looked different now, not just a building she was visiting, but her home. David had clearly made an effort to prepare for her arrival. The windows sparkled, the porch had been swept clean, and fresh curtains hung in the front windows that definitely hadn't been there before. He helped her down from the wagon with careful hands, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "I've prepared a room for you," he said, lifting her small trunk of belongings. "Upstairs, facing east, so you'll catch the morning light." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable and well appointed. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable chairs, and, to her amazement, a substantial bookshelf filled with volumes she wouldn't have expected a rancher to own. Her eyes widened as she took in titles by Shakespeare, Dickens, and Emerson. "You're surprised," David observed, following her gaze. "I am," she admitted. "I didn't expect that you could read." There was amusement in his voice rather than offense. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She insisted on education, even for a boy who seemed destined for ranch work." This revelation shifted something in Hannah's understanding of the man she had just married. She had assumed he was uneducated, despite the careful handwriting on their marriage contract. The discovery that they shared a love of books created an unexpected bridge between them. "I brought some of my own books," she said hesitantly. "I hope that's all right." "More than all right." He gestured toward the bookshelf. "I had hoped you might add to the collection." He showed her through the house, the large kitchen with its modern stove, the dining room that could seat 8, and the parlor with its upright piano that he admitted he couldn't play but had inherited from his mother. Everything was clean and well maintained, but carried the unmistakable air of a home occupied by a solitary man. It needed a woman's touch, flowers, small decorations, and the kind of comfortable, lived-in feeling that came from shared daily life. Her room was on the second floor, spacious and pleasant, with windows that looked out over the rolling hills she had grown to love during her years in Redfern Ridge. He had placed a small writing desk by the window and arranged her few belongings on the dresser with touching care. "I thought you might like to have space for your school preparations," he said, indicating the desk. "And there's a lamp with good light for reading." The thoughtfulness of these arrangements surprised her. This was not the casual gesture of a man fulfilling an obligation, but the careful preparation of someone who had given serious thought to her comfort and needs. As if reading her thoughts, he said quietly, "I want you to be happy here, Hannah. This arrangement benefits me greatly, and I don't want you to feel you've gotten the lesser end of the bargain." That evening, they shared their first meal as husband and wife, beef stew and fresh bread that he had prepared himself, another surprise in a day full of them. The conversation was stilted at first, two strangers feeling their way toward some kind of comfortable interaction. "Tell me about your students," he said as they ate. "Which ones give you the most trouble?" She found herself relaxing as she talked about Josiah Fletcher's struggles with arithmetic and Sarah Mitchell's exceptional abilities, about the challenges of teaching children with such wide age ranges and varying levels of preparation. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that showed he understood more about education than she had expected. "You're good with them?" he said when she finished describing a particularly difficult day with the younger children. "It shows in how they talk about you in town. Their parents respect you, trust you with their children. That's not easy to earn in a place like this." The compliment warmed her more than she had expected. In return, she asked about the ranch, and he told her about the challenges of raising cattle on the prairie, constant worries about weather and disease, the delicate balance between grazing and conservation, and the satisfaction of building something lasting on unforgiving land. After dinner, he excused himself to tend to the evening chores while she explored her new home more thoroughly. The kitchen was well stocked and organized, though clearly arranged by a man who cooked for necessity rather than pleasure. The parlor contained evidence of solitary evenings, a half-finished chess puzzle, several books with markers tucked between pages, a comfortable chair positioned to catch the firelight. When he returned, he found her examining the bookshelf more closely. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. "You have excellent taste in literature," she replied, pulling out a volume of Tennyson. "This is one of my favorites." "Mine too," he said, moving to stand beside her. "Particularly Ulysses. There's something about the idea of always pushing toward the unknown that appeals to me." She looked up at him in surprise. "That's exactly what I love about it. The notion that it's never too late to seek new experiences, to become something different than what you've always been." For a moment, they stood there in comfortable silence, and Hannah felt something shift between them. A recognition of shared understanding, perhaps, or simply the first tentative step toward genuine companionship. "I should let you get settled," he said finally. "Tomorrow will be a busy day. I have work to do on the north fence, and you'll want to prepare for your classes." "Will you mind having a wife who continues to work outside the home?" she asked, suddenly uncertain about this aspect of their arrangement. "I'll be proud to have a wife who's respected for her mind and her abilities," he replied without hesitation. "Most men around here can't say their wives contribute to the community the way you do." Later, as she prepared for bed in her new room, Hannah reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. That morning she had been Miss Wynne, spinster schoolteacher. Tonight she was Mrs. Cutter, married to a man who read Tennyson, arranged wildflower bouquets, and thought carefully about where to place a writing desk for optimal light. It wasn't love. Not yet, perhaps not ever in the passionate sense she had once imagined, but it was something more than mere convenience, something that hinted at possibilities she hadn't dared to consider when she signed their practical contract. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, and for the first time in 8 years, Hannah fell asleep in a house where she wasn't alone. 3 weeks into their marriage, Hannah found herself kneeling in the cold earth behind the ranch house, her hands deep in soil as she planted the kitchen garden seeds David had surprised her with. The small paper packets, carrots, beans, lettuce, herbs, represented more than practical provisions for the coming year. They were a symbol of permanence, of putting down roots, of building a future together that extended beyond mere convenience. "You don't have to do that," David said, approaching from the barn where he'd been tending to a mare with an injured hoof. "I can hire someone from town to plant a garden." "I want to do it," Hannah replied, sitting back on her heels and pushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "I've never had space for more than a few herbs before. This feels hopeful." The word hung between them, laden with meaning neither quite knew how to address directly. Hope suggested expectations beyond their practical arrangement, feelings that went deeper than mutual convenience. Their daily routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the past weeks. Hannah rose early to prepare breakfast, walked to the schoolhouse for her classes, then returned in the afternoon to find David usually working somewhere on the property. Evenings were spent quietly, she grading papers or reading while he tended to ranch business or worked on small repairs. They talked more easily now, sharing observations about the weather, the livestock, her students, his work. But there were moments, fleeting instances, when their hands brushed as she passed him his coffee, or when she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, one that suggested something deeper beginning to take root. I spoke with Marcus Blackwood yesterday, David said, settling onto his heels beside her and examining the neat rows she had marked out for planting. He's been asking questions about our marriage. Hannah's hands stilled in the soil. Marcus Blackwood owned the ranch adjacent to theirs, a man known for his ambition and his resentment of David's success. She had seen him at church, a handsome man in his 40s with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. What kind of questions? Whether it's a real marriage or just a legal arrangement to help you maintain respectability. David's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the tension beneath it. He seems to think a woman like you wouldn't willingly tie herself to a man like me unless there was some kind of desperation involved. The words stung, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they reduced their growing partnership to something sordid and pathetic. Hannah found herself bristling with unexpected protectiveness, not just for herself, but for David and the dignified way he had approached their unconventional arrangement. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him our marriage was none of his business," David replied, but his eyes remained fixed on the garden soil rather than meeting her gaze. "But it got me thinking about appearances, about what people expect from a married couple." Hannah understood what he was driving at. They lived together like polite strangers, sharing space and meals, but maintaining a careful distance that was becoming increasingly noticeable to their neighbors. At church, they sat together but rarely touched. In town, they were cordial but not affectionate. To outside observers, they must seem like exactly what Blackwood suspected, two people locked in a marriage of pure convenience. "Are you concerned about what people think?" she asked. "I'm concerned about what it might mean for you." "You," he replied, finally looking at her. "If people start believing this isn't a real marriage, it could affect how they see you as a teacher." The possibility hadn't occurred to her, but she could see the logic in his concern. Her reputation was crucial to her ability to continue teaching, and anything that cast doubt on her moral character could undermine years of hard work building trust within the community. "What do you suggest?" she asked. For a moment, he looked almost shy, this massive man who could break horses and face down prairie storms without flinching. "We could make more of an effort to appear like a typical married couple in public," he said slowly. "Small things that married people do, such as taking your arm when we walk together, sitting closer in church, maybe." He paused, his cheeks coloring slightly. "Maybe you could call me something other than Mr. Cutter when other people are around." The suggestion was so modest, so reasonable, that Hannah almost smiled. But there was something vulnerable in his expression that kept her from treating it lightly. This man, who had approached their marriage with such practical directness, was asking for permission to act like her husband in public, and clearly finding the request more difficult than he had expected. "I think that would be wise," she said carefully, "for both our sakes." Relief flickered across his features. "Good, that's good." They worked in the garden together for the next hour, their conversation turning to safer topics: which vegetables grew best in prairie soil, how to protect tender plants from unexpected late frosts. But Hannah was aware of a shift between them, subtle yet significant. The boundaries of their relationship were expanding, even if only in small, careful increments. That Sunday at church, she slipped her hand through his arm as they walked up the steps, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her palm. During the service, she sat close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. And when Reverend Matthews asked the congregation to greet their neighbors, David placed his hand gently on the small of her back. A touch so light she might have imagined it, but possessive enough to be noticed by anyone watching. The change in people's reactions was immediate and gratifying. Mrs. Patterson smiled approvingly, nodding as if some question in her mind had been settled. Even Marcus Blackwood, seated 2 pews ahead with his wife, turned to look at them during the service, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in their new closeness. After church, as they stood outside speaking with other parishioners, Dr. Bennett complimented David on how happy Hannah looked. "Marriage agrees with her," the older man observed. David's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her arm. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a note of quiet pride that made Hannah's heart skip. "I'm a fortunate man." The words were perfectly appropriate for public consumption, but when he looked down at her as he said them, she saw something in his eyes that went beyond mere performance. There was genuine warmth there, perhaps even affection, and the discovery sent a flutter of something like hope, attraction, and possibility through her chest. Walking home from church, their new public intimacy felt both natural and strange. She found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way he shortened his stride to match hers, the protective way he guided her around puddles and rough spots in the road. "Thank you," she said as they approached the ranch house. "For what?" "For caring about my reputation, about my teaching. I know this isn't the kind of marriage you might have chosen if circumstances were different." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Hannah," he said, and her name and his deep voice still sent that small thrill through her. "I need you to understand something. I didn't ask you to marry me because I had no other choice. I asked you because I wanted you specifically, the woman who's been teaching the children of this town for 8 years, who reads Tennyson and plants gardens, and speaks her mind when something matters to her." The intensity of his words, the conviction behind them, left her momentarily speechless. This was not the distant practical arrangement she had signed up for. This was something deeper, more personal, more frightening, and more wonderful than she had allowed herself to imagine. "I wanted you too," she said quietly, the admission surprising her with its truth. "Not just the security, not just the respectability. You, the man who reads poetry, builds bookshelves, and treats marriage contracts like sacred documents." They stood there on the path to their house, looking at each other with new understanding, a recognition that their carefully practical arrangement was evolving into something neither of them had expected, but both were beginning to want. That evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, Hannah found herself stealing glances at her husband as he read. The lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and there was something peaceful about his expression that reminded her of the quiet contentment she'd felt working beside him in the garden. Behind their house, the kitchen garden lay freshly planted, neat rows of seeds waiting for spring rain and sunshine to bring them to life. Like their marriage, she realized, something that had begun out of necessity, but was slowly, carefully growing into something more nourishing and sustaining than either of them had dared to hope. The threat from Marcus Blackwood materialized on a gray November morning when he arrived at the ranch with 2 hired men and a surveyor, claiming that David's north pasture actually belonged to him according to newly discovered property records. Hannah watched from the kitchen window as the confrontation unfolded, her hands gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles went white. David stood in the yard, calm but unmistakably dangerous, while Blackwood gestured toward the disputed land. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in her husband's shoulders, the careful way he held himself when anger was building beneath his controlled exterior. When the men finally left, David came inside and sat heavily at the kitchen table, his father's pocket watch in his hands. It was an old silver timepiece, worn smooth from years of handling, and Hannah had never seen him with it before. "My father carried this for 30 years, he said quietly, his thumb tracing the intricate engravings on its surface. "He was working the north pasture when he died, found him there with this watch still ticking in his vest pocket." Hannah moved to sit across from him, drawn by the pain in his voice. In all their weeks of marriage, he had rarely spoken of his family, maintaining the same careful privacy about his past that he showed in all things. "How did he die?" she asked gently. "Heart attack," the doctor said, but he was only 42, strong as an ox. David's jaw tightened. I always wondered if there was more to it. He'd been having disputes with Blackwood about water rights and grazing boundaries. My father was trusting. He believed men settled their differences with words, not weapons. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind rattling the windows. You think Blackwood had something to do with your father's death? I think Marcus Blackwood is the kind of man who sees what he wants and finds ways to take it, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. David closed the watch with a sharp click. He's been circling this ranch like a vulture ever since my father died, looking for any excuse to claim pieces of it. What did he want today? The North Pasture. Claims he has a deed that predates ours by 5 years. David's voice carried a bitter edge. Convenient that this deed should surface just now, when I have a wife to consider, when I'm not just responsible for myself anymore. The protective note in his voice sent warmth through Hannah's chest, even as fear settled like a cold stone in her stomach. She was beginning to understand that their marriage had made them both targets. She, because she was now tied to David's property and prosperity; he, because he now had something precious that could be threatened. What can we do? She asked. Fight it legally for now. Get our own surveyor out there. Examine the documents. He looked at her directly, and for the first time she saw something in his steady brown eyes that resembled uncertainty, perhaps even fear. But Hannah, he added quietly, I need you to understand what you've gotten yourself into by marrying me. This could get dangerous. Are you trying to frighten me away? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I'm trying to give you the chance to leave before things get worse. The words stung more than she had expected. After weeks of growing closeness, of tentative affection blooming between them, he was still thinking of their marriage as something she might wish to escape. And go where? She demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. Back to my cottage? Back to being pitied as the spinster who couldn't even make a marriage of convenience work? You could leave Redfern Ridge entirely, start over somewhere else. I'd make sure you had enough money to stop. The word came out with such force that David actually leaned back in his chair. Do you think I'm the kind of woman who runs at the first sign of trouble? Do you think 8 years of Qing frontier children, of surviving prairie winters alone, of building a life in this harsh country has left me so delicate that I can't handle a land dispute? I think you're brave and strong and deserving of a peaceful life, he replied quietly. I think you've already sacrificed enough for other people's needs, and you shouldn't have to sacrifice your safety for mine. The gentleness in his voice deflated her anger as quickly as it had risen. This wasn't about doubting her strength. It was about his unwillingness to put her in danger, his need to protect what had become precious to him. David, she said, reaching across the table to cover his hands with hers. The touch seemed to surprise them both. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact between them. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly. This is my home now, our home. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. He turned his hands palm up, capturing hers in his much larger ones. The calluses on his fingers told the story of years of hard work, and she found herself tracing them with her thumbs, marveling at the gentleness of which those strong hands were capable. I've never had anyone to protect before, he admitted quietly. Never had anyone whose safety mattered more than my own. It's terrifying. The confession was so honest, so vulnerable, that it took her breath away. This man, who seemed strong enough to wrestle bears, was afraid. Not for himself, but for her. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. We protect each other. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they sat together on the parlor sofa instead of in separate chairs. It was a small thing, but significant. Another boundary crossed, another step toward genuine intimacy. As she worked on her lesson plans and he examined the legal documents related to the property dispute, their shoulders touched occasionally, creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Read me something, he said suddenly, nodding toward the book of poetry she had set aside. She picked up the volume of Tennyson and turned to one of her favorite passages. Her voice was soft in the quiet room as she read aloud, and she was acutely aware of him listening, of the way his attention focused entirely on her as she spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Your voice is lovely," he said at last. "I could listen to you read all evening." The compliment sent heat flooding into her cheeks. "My students would disagree. They say I get too dramatic when I read stories aloud." "They're wrong." His voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You bring the words to life." Later, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, David caught her hand gently as she moved past him toward the stairs. "Hannah," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her heart skip. "Thank you for staying, for choosing to stand with me instead of seeking safety elsewhere." She looked up at him, this giant of a man who read poetry, worried about her safety, and carried his father's watch like a talisman against loss. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me something worth standing for." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, just as he had on their wedding day. But this time, the gesture felt different, less formal, more intimate, charged with the growing connection between them. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Hannah carried with her the memory of his touch, the warmth in his eyes, and the growing certainty that their practical arrangement was transforming into something deeper and more precious than either of them had dared to hope for. Outside, the November wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of winter storms and unknown challenges. But inside their home, something fragile and beautiful was taking root, growing stronger with each passing day. The forgery was discovered in the most unlikely of places, stuck between the pages of a book on cattle breeding that Hannah had borrowed from the church library. She had been looking for information to better understand David's work when the folded paper fluttered out, landing at her feet, like a message from fate itself. At first glance, it appeared to be just another land deed, the kind of legal document that multiplied like weeds in a territory where boundaries constantly shifted and claims overlapped. But as her teacher's eye, trained to spot discrepancies and forgeries in student work, examined the document more closely, she noticed several troubling inconsistencies. The paper was aged, certainly, but the ink seemed too dark, too fresh. The handwriting, while attempting to mimic the formal script of official documents from 20 years past, had subtle characteristics marking it as much more recent. Most damning of all, the surveyor's seal bore a name she recognized: Thomas Hartley, who had only been licensed in the territory for 3 years. Her hands trembled with the implications of what she held. Gathering her skirts, she ran across the prairie toward the north pasture where David was mending fences. The wind whipped her hair from its careful bun, her breath coming in sharp puffs of cold air, but she didn't slow until she reached him. "David," she called, holding up the document. "You need to see this." He straightened immediately, sensing the urgency in her voice. When she pressed the paper into his hands, his expression darkened with each line he read. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly, but there was something dangerous in his tone that made her step closer to him instinctively. "Between the pages of a book from the church library, hidden as if someone meant to retrieve it later but forgot." She watched his face as understanding dawned. "It's a fake, isn't it? The deed Blackwood showed the surveyor." "More than fake." His voice was steady, but she could see the anger building in his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "This is a practice copy. Look here." He pointed to corrections in the margin, places where someone had tested different variations of the forged handwriting. Whoever made this was perfecting their technique before creating the final version. The implications crashed over Hannah like a cold wave. He's been planning this for years. Longer than that, I think. David folded the document carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "My father died 20 years ago this month. Right here in this pasture, working alone, no witnesses." He looked out over the disputed land with eyes that seemed to see into the past. "I was 17, grieving, overwhelmed, trying to run a ranch I wasn't ready for. If someone had wanted to alter property records, steal land, cover up a crime, that would have been the perfect time." The words hung between them, heavy with terrible possibility. Hannah felt sick as the full scope of Marcus Blackwood's deception became clear. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about murder, covered up with forged documents and decades of patient planning. "We have to tell someone," she said. The sheriff, the territorial authorities. With what proof? David's laugh was bitter. A document that shows someone practiced forging a deed? That's not evidence of murder, Hannah. It's barely evidence of fraud. Then what do we do? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Marcus Blackwood was riding toward them with 4 men, all armed, their faces grim with purpose. Hannah moved instinctively closer to David, and she felt his arm come around her protectively. "Cutter!" Blackwood called out, reining in his horse 20 feet away. "I've come to give you one last chance to be reasonable about the North Pasture. Sign over the deed, and there won't be any unpleasantness." "The answer's the same as it was yesterday," David replied calmly, though Hannah could feel the tension in his body like a coiled spring. "This land belongs to me, and it's staying with me." Blackwood's eyes shifted to Hannah, and she didn't like what she saw there, a calculating coldness that made her skin crawl. "Even if it means putting your pretty little wife in danger?" The threat was unmistakable, and Hannah felt David's arm tighten around her. But instead of the fear she expected, she felt a blazing anger rise in her chest. How dare this man come to their home, threaten their life together, try to take what they were building with lies and intimidation? "You're wasting your time, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying all the authority she used with unruly students. "We know about the forged deed. We know you've been planning this fraud for years." The color drained from Blackwood's face, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Hannah pulled the practice document from David's hand and held it up. "Thomas Hartley's seal on a deed supposedly 23 years old, when he's only been licensed for 3. Handwriting that looks suspiciously like yours, Marcus. Corrections in the margins where you practiced your forgery." Blackwood's composure cracked completely. "Give me that paper." "So you can destroy the evidence?" "I don't think so." She tucked the document into her bodice where it would be safe from grabbing hands. "This is going to the territorial authorities, along with a full account of your attempts to defraud my husband." "Your husband?" Blackwood snarled, his mask of civility falling away. "You think he told you the whole truth about your precious practical marriage? Ask him about the night his father died, about what really happened in this pasture." Hannah felt David go rigid beside her, but she kept her eyes fixed on Blackwood. "What are you talking about?" "His father didn't die of a heart attack," Blackwood said, his voice ugly with malice. He died. He died because he was too stubborn to accept a reasonable business proposition. When I offered to buy this pasture at a fair price, he refused. When I suggested we could settle things privately, he threatened to go to the sheriff." Blackwood's smile was cold as a winter wind. "So I helped him understand that some decisions can't be taken back." The confession struck like a physical blow. Hannah heard David make a sound deep in his throat, something between a growl and a sob, and she realized they had just heard a man admit to murder. "You killed him," David said, his voice barely human. "I defended myself when he attacked me," Blackwood replied smoothly. Unfortunately, his heart couldn't handle the strain of confrontation. By the time I got help, it was too late. It was a lie wrapped in just enough truth to sound believable, self-defense if ever brought to court. "And then you spent 20 years forging documents to steal his land," Hannah said, her teacher's mind assembling of deceit. "You waited until his son had a wife, someone you could threaten, something you could take away." "Nothing personal," Blackwood said, his reasonable tone at odds with the guns his men now held ready. "Just business. Land is valuable, and I saw an opportunity to acquire some at a fair price." "Murder and fraud," Hannah replied coldly. "Your definition of reasonable business practices." Blackwood shrugged. "The frontier's a dangerous place. Accidents happen, people disappear. Young widows sometimes decide to leave painful memories behind and start over elsewhere." The threat was clear. Ice slid down Hannah's spine, but beneath it burned something fiercer, a determination to protect the life she and David were building, to stand against this man who had already destroyed so much. "You made one mistake, Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "And what's that?" "You assumed I was the kind of woman who could be intimidated." Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching, the same look that had silenced a roomful of unruly students more than once. For a fleeting second, uncertainty flickered in Blackwood's expression. Then his face hardened, and he gestured to his men. "We'll see about that," he said. "You have until sundown tomorrow to sign over the deed to the north pasture. If you don't, your husband might have an accident, just like his father did. And pretty young widows, well, they sometimes need comforting in their grief." He wheeled his horse around and rode off with his men, leaving Hannah and David standing in the fading light. The forged document burned against her chest, where she had hidden it, proof of crimes stretching back 20 years, and a promise of more violence if they failed to stop Marcus Blackwood once and for all. "He killed my father," David said quietly, the words torn from deep within him. "Yes," Hannah answered, taking his hand. "And now we're going to make sure he pays for it." That night, David disappeared into the barn and returned with a gun case Hannah had never seen. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay a Winchester rifle, old but meticulously cared for. His hands were reverent as he lifted it, checking the mechanism with the practiced ease of a man who had known war. "I hoped I'd never have to touch this again," he said softly, not meeting her eyes. "Carried it for 3 years in the army before I came home. Swore when I left that I was done with killing." Hannah watched him clean and load the weapon, his movements precise, economical. This was another side of the man she'd married. Not just the gentle rancher who read poetry and built her bookshelves, but the soldier who had seen violence firsthand. "You don't have to do this alone," she said quietly. He looked up, pain and tenderness mingling in his eyes. "Hannah, you can't be part of this. If something happens to me—" "Nothing is going to happen to you," she interrupted, moving to the gun case. Her hand found a smaller pistol that fit more comfortably in her grip. "And I'm not letting you face Blackwood and his men without backup." "You don't know how to use that." "Then teach me." Her voice carried the same resolve that had seen her through 8 years of frontier teaching. The same strength that had helped her rebuild after heartbreak. "I won't hide in the house while my husband fights for our future." For a long moment they faced each other across the kitchen table, the weapons between them symbols of choices neither had wanted to make. Then David reached for the pistol, checking its action with care. "Basic principles first," he said, his tone shifting to that of an instructor. "Never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. Always assume it's loaded. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot." They spent the next hour in the barn, hay bales serving as targets. Her hands shook at first, not from fear but from the weight of what they were preparing for. By the end, she was hitting the center of the target more often than not. Her ears rang from the gunfire, her arms ached. "You're a natural," David said as they walked back to the house. There was pride in his voice, along with the ever-present worry. "Shooting at hay bales isn't the same as shooting at men who want to kill us," she said. "I know. I just won't let fear make me useless when you need me." The next morning brought visitors, Dr. Bennett, Reverend Matthews, and 3 other men from town, all armed and grim-faced. Hannah watched from the kitchen window as they spoke with David in the yard, their voices low, their faces set. When David came inside, his expression was lighter than it had been since Blackwood's threat. "Word's gotten around about what happened," he said, settling at the table. "Seems Blackwood's been making enemies for years. Bennett's treated men with suspicious injuries, hands who knew too much. Matthews says 3 families left town after land disputes with him. They're ready to help, to stand with us." He reached across the table and took her hand. "This isn't just about our ranch anymore. It's about stopping a man who's been terrorizing this county for decades." The plan they formed was simple but solid. Blackwood's deadline was sundown, and they expected he'd come personally with his hired guns. The men from town would position themselves around the property, behind the barn, near the creek, in the loft, creating a trap no outlaw could escape. "What's my role?" Hannah asked. "You stay in the house, safe," David said automatically. But his tone told her he already knew what her answer would be. "No." She looked around the table at the gathered men, her voice calm but commanding. "This started because Blackwood thinks a woman is a weakness. I won't hide while others fight for me." Dr. Bennett cleared his throat. "Mrs. Cutter, with all respect, this isn't work for a lady." "With all respect, Doctor," she said evenly, I've been taking care of myself on this frontier for 8 years. I can shoot, I can think clearly, and I have every right to defend my home. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but David was watching her with quiet pride. She's right, he said. This is her fight, too, and she's proven she won't be intimidated. Reverend Matthews looked troubled. It goes against nature, a woman in a gun battle. What goes against nature, Hannah replied sharply, is murder disguised as business. Marcus Blackwood killed my husband's father and has spent 20 years profiting from it. If you think I'll cower in the corner while he tries the same with David, you don't know me very well. After more argument, the men relented. Hannah would take position upstairs, watching the approach from the main road, ready to cover them if needed. It wasn't the front line, but it was enough, an acknowledgement of her courage and her claim to the life they'd built together. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the men took their places. Dr. Bennett behind the barn, Reverend Matthews and two others hidden among the cottonwoods by the creek, another man in the loft. David stood alone in the yard, visible and waiting, the rifle within easy reach. She settled herself at the bedroom window, the pistol loaded and ready in her hands. From this vantage point, she could see the road stretching away toward town, empty now, but soon to carry men intent on violence and theft. The waiting was the hardest part. As the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, Hannah found her mind wandering to the changes in her life over the past months. 6 months ago, she had been resigned to spinsterhood, content with her small, safe existence as the town's schoolteacher. Now she was married to a man she was falling in love with, preparing to fight a gun battle against murderers and thieves. The irony wasn't lost on her, that Marcus Blackwood's threats had accomplished something he had never intended. They had forced her and David to depend on each other, to move beyond the careful boundaries of their practical arrangement into something deeper and more precious than either had dared hope for. A movement on the road caught her attention. Riders approaching, 5 men, heavily armed. Marcus Blackwood unmistakable in the lead. Hannah felt her heart begin to race, but her hands remained steady on the pistol. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just their physical survival, but whether the life she and David were building together could continue to grow. She watched as they drew closer, saw the confident way Blackwood sat his horse, the casual violence in his companion's postures. He thought this would be easy. An intimidated rancher and his frightened wife surrendering valuable land rather than risk a fight they couldn't win. He was about to learn how wrong he was. "Be careful," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant for David, for herself, or for the fragile but growing love that had surprised them both with its strength and its promise. The school bell Hannah had borrowed from the schoolhouse sat on the windowsill beside her, its brass surface gleaming in the late afternoon sun. It would be her signal to the men positioned around the ranch. 3 quick rings when Blackwood and his riders came within range, 2 more when the shooting started. She didn't have to wait long. Marcus Blackwood rode into the yard like a conquering general, his 4 hired guns spreading out in a practiced formation that spoke of experience with this kind of intimidation. They were confident, relaxed, clearly expecting no real resistance from a rancher and his schoolteacher wife. "Cutter," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Time's up. You ready to be reasonable, or do we have to make this unpleasant?" David stood in front of the house, his hands loose at his sides, the Winchester rifle leaning against the porch rail within easy reach. From her position at the window, Hannah could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he balanced his weight, ready to move in any direction at a moment's notice. "I told you yesterday," David replied, his voice calm and steady. "This land stays with me. It belonged to my father, and it belongs to me." "Your father's dead," Blackwood said with casual cruelty. "Has been for 20 years. Time to let go of the past and face reality." Hannah's hand tightened on the school bell. The men were close enough now, well within the range they had discussed. She lifted the bell and rang it 3 times, the clear bronze notes carrying across the prairie like a warning. Blackwood's head snapped up at the sound, his eyes searching for the source. "What was that?" "That," said Dr. Bennett, emerging from behind the barn with his rifle trained on the nearest hired gun, "was the sound of your luck running out, Marcus. The transformation was immediate and electric. Blackwood's men reached for their weapons, but they found themselves facing gun barrels from three directions as the townsmen emerged from their hiding places. Reverend Matthews stepped out from the cottonwoods, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by grim determination. The other men appeared from their cover, all armed and ready. "Seems you're outnumbered," David said, finally reaching for his Winchester and bringing it to bear on Blackwood himself. "Maybe you should reconsider your position." For a moment, the tableau held 10 armed men facing each other across the ranch yard, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Hannah held her breath, knowing the next few seconds would determine whether this ended with words or violence. Then one of Blackwood's men, a lean, dangerous-looking individual with scars across his face, made the decision for everyone. His hand darted toward his gun, and the yard exploded into chaos. Hannah rang the school bell twice more. The signal for battle joined, though the gunfire that erupted made any further signals unnecessary. She brought her pistol up, sighted on one of Blackwood's men who was trying to flank Dr. Bennett, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil surprised her, stronger than she had expected, but her shot was true. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, his own weapon flying from his grasp. She had never shot another human being before, and the reality of it hit her like a physical blow. The responsibility, the irreversible nature of violence, the way it changed everything in an instant. But there was no time for reflection. Below in the yard, David was moving with the fluid grace of a trained soldier, using the porch for cover as he worked his rifle with deadly efficiency. One of Blackwood's men was down permanently. Another was wounded and crawling for safety. But Marcus Blackwood himself had dismounted and was stalking toward the house with murder in his eyes. "Come out here, Cutter," he shouted, his composure cracking. "Face me like a man instead of hiding behind that school-teaching wife of yours." The insult sent rage flashing through Hannah's chest. She leaned out the window, pistol trained on Blackwood's center mass. "I'm not hiding," she called down to him. "I'm right here." Blackwood's head snapped up, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. She saw surprise there, and something that might have been respect, before his face hardened again. "Should have minded your own business, schoolteacher," he snarled, bringing his own gun up toward her window. But David was already moving, lunging from the porch with a roar of pure rage that seemed to shake the very air. "Don't you dare point that gun at my wife!" The two men collided in the center of the yard with bone-jarring force, Blackwood's shot going wide as David tackled him to the ground. They rolled in the dust, grappling for control of their weapons, and Hannah realized with horror that she couldn't get a clear shot without risking her husband. Around them, the battle was ending. Dr. Bennett and the other townsmen had subdued or scattered the remaining hired guns. But the real fight, the personal war between David and the man who had murdered his father, was just beginning. Blackwood was smaller than David, but wiry and desperate, fighting with the vicious cunning of a cornered animal. He managed to break free, scrambling backward, his gun coming up again. "Should have died with your father," he screamed, finger tightening on the trigger. The school bell was still in Hannah's left hand, its weight solid and reassuring. Without conscious thought, she drew back her arm and hurled it with all the strength and accuracy that 8 years of playground supervision had given her. The brass bell struck Blackwood in the side of the head with a resounding clang, sending him staggering sideways just as his shot went off. The bullet meant for David's heart passed harmlessly through the air where he had been standing a moment before. And then David was on him again, this time with no interference, no weapons between them, just two men settling a debt 20 years overdue. The fight in the yard was brutal and decisive. Blackwood, dazed from the bell's impact, could not match David's combination of size, strength, and righteous fury. Within moments, he was pinned to the ground, David's hands around his throat. 20 years of grief and anger finally finding their target. "This is for my father," David growled, his voice barely human. "For every year you let me believe he died of natural causes. For every night I wondered if I could have saved him." Blackwood's face was turning purple, his legs kicking weakly as he struggled for air. Around them, the other men watched in grim silence, understanding this was justice being served, not murder. But Hannah could see something in her husband's face that terrified her, a darkness that spoke of a line about to be crossed, a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life, no matter how justified it might be. The soldier in him, the part that had seen too much violence, was taking control. "David," she called from the window, her voice cutting through the red haze of his rage. "Don't. He's not worth damning yourself." For a moment his grip tightened, and she thought he might not hear her. Then his eyes found hers across the distance, and she saw the man she had married fighting against the darkness of his past, love warring with vengeance in his expression. Slowly his hands loosened. Blackwood gasped and wheezed, drawing desperate breaths, but he was alive. "You're right," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's not worth it." He looked down at the broken man beneath him. "But he is going to pay for what he's done." Dr. Bennett stepped forward with rope from his medical bag, and they bound Blackwood securely while he was still too dazed to resist. The forged deed Hannah had discovered, along with Blackwood's own confession in front of witnesses, would be enough to see him hanged for murder and fraud. As the adrenaline of battle began to fade, Hannah found herself shaking. She set the pistol carefully on the windowsill and hurried downstairs, desperate to touch her husband, to reassure herself he was whole and unharmed. He met her at the bottom of the stairs, his arms coming around her with desperate strength. For a long moment they held each other without words, both trembling with the aftermath of violence and the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything they were building together. "I thought he was going to kill you," she whispered against his chest. "I thought he was going to shoot you out of that window," he replied, voice rough with emotion. "When I saw him point that gun at you." "But he didn't," she murmured. "We're both here. We're both alive." Dr. Bennett cleared his throat respectfully. "We should get Blackwood to town, turn him over to the sheriff before word gets out and someone decides to take justice into their own hands." As the men prepared to transport their prisoner, Reverend Matthews approached Hannah with something glittering in his hands, her mother's wedding ring, which she realized she had never actually worn. "I found this on the ground," he said gently. "Must have fallen from your things during the fight." She stared at the simple gold band, a symbol of dreams she had once thought lost forever. Then she looked up at David, the man who had given her not the passionate romance she had once imagined, but something deeper and more lasting. Partnership, respect, and love that had grown from practical beginnings into something precious and true. "Would you put it on my finger?" she asked quietly. His hands were gentle as he slipped the ring into place, his eyes never leaving hers. "With this ring," he said softly, echoing words from a ceremony they had never had, "I thee wed, not from convenience or necessity, but from love." "From love?" she repeated, and the words felt like a vow more sacred than any they had spoken in a church. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, as Marcus Blackwood was loaded into Dr. Bennett's wagon for the journey to town and to justice. His hired guns were either dead or captured. His decades-long reign of terror was finally over. "It's over," David said, his arm tight around Hannah's waist as they watched the wagon disappear down the road. "No," she replied, glancing down at the wedding ring that now rested where it belonged, on the hand of a woman who had found the love she thought would never come. "It's just beginning." The school bell lay in the dust where it had fallen after striking Blackwood, its bronze surface dented but still intact. Tomorrow she would return it to the schoolhouse where it belonged, where it would continue to call children to learning and the community to gather. But tonight, it had served a different purpose, not just as a signal or a weapon, but as a symbol of the life she had built on her own and would now continue building with the man she loved. A life that had begun out of practical necessity, but had blossomed into something neither of them had dared hope for when they signed that simple contract so many weeks ago. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around their home, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of children who would play in these yards, of a love that had been tested by fire and found strong enough to last a lifetime. 6 months after Marcus Blackwood's trial and execution, Hannah stood in the doorway of the nursery David had built onto their home, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The baby's cradle sat in the corner, crafted from prairie oak by her husband's skilled hands, its surface smooth as silk and strong as the love that had created it. Spring had come early to Redfern Ridge. Through the nursery windows, she could see the kitchen garden they had planted together blooming with new life. Carrots and beans thrived in neat rows, herbs filled the air with fragrance, and the small apple trees David had surprised her with were heavy with blossoms. "Talking to the little one already?" David asked from behind her, his arms circling her waist, hands resting over hers on their unborn child. "Telling him about his father," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth, "about the man who builds cradles, plants gardens, and reads poetry by firelight." "Him?" David's voice held gentle amusement. "You sound very certain about that. A mother knows these things." She turned in his arms, marveling, as she did every day, at the way this giant of a man could be so tender, so careful with the precious things in his life. "Besides, you wanted strong sons to guard our winters. Remember?" His expression softened with memory and wonder. "I remember a lot from that day, how terrified I was that you'd refuse, how certain I was that I was asking too much of you." "You weren't asking too much," she said, reaching up to trace the laugh lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of shared joy and burdens eased by partnership. "You were offering me everything I thought I'd lost forever." The sound of children's voices drifted from the schoolhouse, carried on the morning air, reminding her that in an hour she would need to ring the school bell, the same brass bell that had once served as her weapon, now returned to its rightful purpose of calling young minds to learning. She had continued teaching throughout her pregnancy with David's full support and the community's blessing, and would do so until their child needed her more than her students did. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by yesterday while you were in town," she said. "She wanted to know if we'd decided on names yet." "And what did you tell her?" "That we were considering several options." She smiled up at him. "Though I do have a favorite. Let me guess, something literary. Byron, Tennyson, Shakespeare?" She laughed, the sound filling the sunny nursery with joy. "Samuel, after your father, so our son will know the good man he's named for and the legacy he's inheriting." The emotion that crossed David's face was almost too intense to bear. His father's pocket watch had been returned to its rightful place, not as a talisman of grief, but as a symbol of continuity, of love passed from one generation to the next. "Samuel," he said quietly, testing the name. "It has a good sound to it, a strong name for a strong boy, one who'll grow up knowing he's loved, wanted, and part of something bigger than himself." They stood together in comfortable silence, contemplating the future that stretched before them. Spring planting and harvest celebrations, first steps and first words, the daily joys and challenges of building a life together on the unforgiving but beautiful prairie they both loved. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked suddenly. "Giving up your independence, tying yourself to a rancher you barely knew?" Hannah considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the past months. The woman who had signed that practical contract seemed like a stranger now, resigned once to loneliness, convinced that love was a luxury she could never afford. "I regret wasting so many years believing I wasn't worthy of this," she said finally. "I regret all the time we might have had if I'd been brave enough to hope for something better than mere survival. And I regret thinking that practical arrangements were safer than risking my heart," he said softly, his hands resting over the curve where their child grew. "Turns out love was the practical choice all along. Just took me 35 years to figure that out." The school bell began its familiar call across the prairie, rung by Sarah Mitchell, who had volunteered to help with school duties as Hannah's pregnancy advanced. Soon, children would fill the one-room schoolhouse with eager voices and boundless energy, learning lessons that would prepare them for their own futures on the frontier. But for now, Hannah and David stood in their child's nursery, surrounded by the life they had built from nothing more than mutual need and careful hope. The baby's cradle waited patiently for its first occupant, a symbol of dreams fulfilled and promises kept, of practical love that had blossomed into something rare and lasting. Outside their window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast, challenging, and full of possibilities. Once, that landscape had seemed to mock Hannah's solitude, emphasizing her isolation with its empty beauty. Now it spoke of abundance and opportunity, of room to grow and dream and build something enduring with the man who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself. I love you, she said, the words still feeling new and wonderful on her tongue. I love you too, he replied. And in his voice she heard the promise of all their tomorrows, practical and passionate, grounded in reality, but lifted by hope, as enduring as the prairie grass, and as constant as the wind that would always sing across their land. The baby moved beneath her hands, a small kick of acknowledgement, and Hannah smiled. Their son would grow up knowing he was wanted, knowing he was part of a love story that had begun with a simple contract, but had grown into something rich, complex, and beautiful. In the distance, the school bell continued its patient call, summoning the future to begin. Would you like me to help you write a short epilogue paragraph or story afterward to close the book? Something like